Officer Mark Reynolds had been working as a police officer for nearly 20 years. He had seen all kinds of situations, some routine, some dangerous, and some that left a mark on his soul. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen on this quiet evening. It was a chilly night, and the streets were nearly empty. The small town where Mark worked wasn't known for much crime, but officers still had to be on alert. As he drove his patrol car through the main road, his sharp eyes caught something unusual, a black sedan speeding past a red light. The car didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. That was enough for Mark to turn on his flashing lights and signal the driver to pull over. At first, the vehicle didn't stop. Mark felt a slight tension rise in his chest. It wasn't uncommon for people to hesitate, especially if they were distracted or nervous. But as a police officer, he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about this car didn't feel right. After a few seconds, the sedan finally pulled to the side of the road. Mark parked behind it and took a deep breath. He reached for his radio and called in the traffic stop, as protocol required. Then, placing his hand lightly on his holster, not out of fear, but out of habit, he stepped out of his patrol car and approached the vehicle. The driver's window was already rolled down. Inside, a young man sat gripping the steering wheel tightly. He looked to be in his early 20s, his face pale, his fingers tapping nervously against the dashboard. His behavior wasn't exactly unusual. Many people got nervous when pulled over by the police, but there was something in his eyes that made Mark uneasy. "Good evening, sir," Mark said calmly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The driver hesitated before answering. I think I might have run that light back there," he stammered. Mark studied him carefully. "That's right. License and registration, please." As the driver fumbled with his wallet, Mark's eyes shifted to the back seat. Two passengers were sitting there, their faces half hidden in the dim light. One of them was a girl with dark hair, looking down at her lap. The other passenger sat completely still, his hood pulled up over his head. Mark's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. The shape of the young man's face, the curve of his jawline, it was eerily familiar. A wave of confusion washed over him. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His heartbeat quickened as he adjusted his flashlight, angling it toward the passenger. The boy shifted slightly, and for a brief second, their eyes met. Mark's entire body froze. He had seen that face before. It was the face of his son, Jacob, the same son he had buried 3 years ago. Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. His mind struggled to make sense of what he had just seen. The face staring back at him from the back seat looked exactly like his son, Jacob, the son he had mourned, the son he had buried 3 years ago. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he questioned whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. The young man quickly turned his face away, pulling his hood lower as if trying to hide. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his flashlight tighter. He wanted to speak, to call out Jacob's name, but his voice wouldn't come. His training told him to stay calm, to handle the situation like any other traffic stop. But how could he? His mind raced with questions. Was this really Jacob? Had he been alive all this time? And if so, what was he doing in this car with these people? Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay focused. He couldn't let his emotions take over. Not yet. He turned his attention back to the driver, who was still nervously searching for his registration papers. "Who are the passengers in the back?" Mark asked, his voice steady but firm. The driver hesitated. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "But just some friends," he said quickly, not making eye contact. Mark glanced at the girl, who sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look up, didn't move. Then he looked at the boy again. He still had his hood up, staring at the floor, avoiding Mark's gaze. Something wasn't right. Mark could feel it deep in his gut, the same instinct that had saved his life countless times in the line of duty. He needed to get the boy out of the car, needed to see him up close, needed to hear his voice. "Step out of the car," Mark said, his tone firmer now. The driver's eyes widened. "Do what? Why?" he asked, forcing a nervous smile. "Step out of the car," Mark repeated. His voice was calm, but there was no room for argument. The driver hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror. Mark didn't miss the silent exchange between him and the boy in the back seat. It was quick, just a second, but it was enough to tell Mark that something was seriously wrong. Then, without warning, the driver did something that made Mark's blood run cold. He reached for the gear shift. Mark's heart slammed in his chest as he realized what was about to happen. "Don't do it," he warned, stepping back toward his patrol car. "Don't even think about it." But the driver didn't listen. In an instant, the car's tires screeched against the pavement, the engine roaring to life as the vehicle sped off into the night. Mark barely had time to react before the car disappeared down the road. His son was inside, and he wasn't about to lose him again. Mark's heart pounded as the black sedan sped away, its taillights glowing in the dark night. For a split second, he stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. But then, his instincts kicked in. He rushed back to his patrol car, threw open the door, and grabbed the radio. "This is Officer Reynolds. Vehicle fleeing from a traffic stop. Black sedan. Heading east on Main Street. I need backup now." As he spoke, he slammed the car into drive and hit the gas, his tires screeching against the pavement as he sped after the fleeing car. The adrenaline surged through his veins, but his thoughts were racing even faster. His son, who was supposed to be gone, was in that car. How? Why? Was he in danger? Was he being held against his will? The sedan weaved dangerously through the empty streets, running another red light. Mark gritted his teeth, keeping his focus sharp. He couldn't afford to lose them. His hands tightened around the wheel as he pushed the speedometer higher, keeping a close distance without risking an accident. "Dispatch, do we have any units near Lincoln Avenue?" Mark called into his radio. A voice crackled back. "Affirmative. Unit 47 is a minute away." Mark could see the sedan trying to shake him, swerving left and right, but he wasn't going to let them escape. He knew these roads better than anyone. Up ahead, the street curved sharply before leading to a narrow bridge. If they weren't careful, they could crash. "Slow down," Mark muttered under his breath, almost as if speaking to the driver. "Don't do something stupid." But the car didn't slow down. Instead, it picked up speed. Mark's stomach twisted. He couldn't let this chase end in disaster. He turned his siren up to full blast, hoping the noise would make the driver rethink his reckless escape. But the sedan kept going, barreling toward the bridge at full speed. Just then, flashing red and blue lights appeared from the opposite direction. Another patrol car was closing in fast, blocking the way forward. Mark's backup had arrived just in time. The driver of the sedan had two choices: stop or risk crashing. For a moment, it seemed like he would stop. The car wobbled slightly, hesitating. Mark held his breath. Then, in a desperate move, the driver swerved sharply to the right, trying to escape down a narrow side street. But he had miscalculated. The road was too tight, too sharp. The tires screeched as the car lost control. Mark watched as the sedan skidded, spun, and then slammed into a street pole with a loud crash. The impact shook the ground. Smoke rose from the hood, and for a moment, everything went still. Mark didn't waste a second. He threw his car into park, jumped out, and reached for his weapon, just in case. His son was in that car, and he was about to find out the truth. Mark's pulse was racing as he ran toward the crashed sedan. Smoke curled up from the engine, and the car's front bumper was crushed against the street pole. He could hear the faint sound of the car's horn blaring, stuck from the impact. His instincts screamed at him to be careful, but his heart was pounding for only one reason. His son was inside. With his gun drawn, Mark approached the driver's side cautiously. The young man who had been behind the wheel was slumped forward, groaning in pain. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but he wasn't moving much. Mark reached for the door handle and yanked it open. "Step out of the car, now," Mark ordered firmly. The driver groaned, slowly lifting his hands in surrender. His face was pale with fear, sweat dripping from his forehead. Mark quickly checked him for any weapons, then pulled him out and guided him to the ground. Another officer from the backup unit arrived, securing the driver while Mark turned his attention to the back seat. His breath hitched as he moved toward the passenger door. The girl in the back seat had already pushed the door open and was trying to stumble out. She looked shaken, her hands trembling as she grabbed onto the car for support. Mark made sure she was unharmed before shifting his focus to the last person inside. The hooded boy still hadn't moved. He was sitting completely still, his hands clenched together, his face hidden from view. Mark felt his chest tighten. He took a deep breath and reached for the hood. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it back. And then time seemed to stop. The face beneath the hood was exactly as Mark remembered, only older, thinner, and filled with fear. The boy's blue eyes, the same eyes Mark had seen in old photographs, were wide with shock. His lips trembled slightly, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Mark felt his entire body go numb. "Jacob," he whispered, barely able to speak. The boy flinched at the name, his expression flickering with something between recognition and fear. Mark's hands trembled. His mind raced with memories. Jacob's laughter when he was little, the way he used to run into his arms after school, the unbearable pain of losing him 3 years ago. And now, here he was, sitting in front of him, alive. Jacob opened his mouth as if to speak, but before he could, the driver, still on the ground, shouted desperately, "Don't talk. Just keep quiet." Mark's eyes snapped toward the driver, anger flashing through him. But Jacob looked terrified, as if speaking would put him in danger. Mark softened his voice. "Son, it's okay. You're safe now." Jacob's lips quivered, his eyes darting between Mark and the driver. And then, in the smallest, weakest voice, he whispered, "Dad." Mark felt tears sting his eyes. His son was alive. But something was terribly wrong. Mark felt his breath hitch the moment he heard that single word, "Dad." It was soft, hesitant, almost as if Jacob himself wasn't sure if he should say it. But it was real. His son, the boy he thought he had lost forever, was sitting right in front of him, alive. His hands shook as he reached toward Jacob, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me, son. It's really me." Jacob looked like he wanted to believe it, but fear was written all over his face. His body was tense, as if he was expecting something bad to happen at any moment. He glanced toward the driver, who was now sitting on the ground, his face filled with anger. Mark didn't care about the driver right now. His only focus was Jacob. He gently placed a hand on his son's arm, afraid that if he moved too fast, Jacob might pull away. "It's okay now," Mark said softly. "You don't have to be scared anymore." Jacob swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. He looked at Mark with uncertainty, as if struggling to believe that this was real. His eyes were filled with emotions, fear, confusion, and something else, pain. Mark's heart ached. How had this happened? How had his son been alive all these years without him knowing? Where had he been? The girl who had been in the backseat with Jacob suddenly spoke, her voice shaky. "We need to go," she said in a whisper, looking around nervously. "They'll come looking for us." Mark's eyes narrowed. Who's coming?" Jacob's hands tightened into fists. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he kept his lips pressed together. The fear in his eyes deepened. Mark could feel the weight of something much bigger than just a traffic stop. Jacob hadn't just been missing. He had been taken. And now, whoever had taken him didn't want him to talk. His jaw tightened. He turned to the backup officer standing nearby. "Get them in the car," he ordered, motioning toward the driver and the girl. "We need to get to the station. Now." The officer nodded and started securing the driver, who kept muttering under his breath. Mark turned back to Jacob and knelt in front of him. "Son, I know you're scared. I don't know what happened to you, but I promise I'm not going to let anything happen to you again." His voice broke slightly, but he didn't care. "I thought I lost you once. I'm not losing you again." Jacob's lips trembled. For a moment, Mark thought he might finally tell them the truth. But instead, Jacob whispered something that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "They're watching us." Mark's breath caught. Who was watching? And then, in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. Someone was coming. Mark's grip on Jacob's arm tightened as the distant headlights grew closer. His instincts screamed danger. The way Jacob had whispered, "They're watching us," sent chills down his spine. Whoever they were coming. Fast. Mark quickly turned to the backup officer. "Get them in the car now," he ordered. The officer nodded, hurrying to secure the driver and the girl in the patrol car. But Mark stayed with Jacob, his heart racing. His son was trembling, his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. "Jacob, listen to me," Mark said firmly but gently. "I won't let anything happen to you, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Jacob hesitated, his breath shaky. Then, slowly, he gave a small nod. That was all Mark needed. He took Jacob's arm and guided him toward the patrol car. But before they could reach it, the unknown vehicle suddenly sped up. Tires screeched against the pavement. The car's headlights flashed brightly, momentarily blinding Mark. His instincts took over. He shielded Jacob, stepping in front of him as the vehicle came to a sharp stop just a few feet away. The engine rumbled loudly, but no one stepped out. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. Mark's hand instinctively moved to his holster. The tension in the air was thick. Something wasn't right. "Stay behind me," Mark whispered to Jacob, his stance firm. Then, the driver's side door slowly opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed in black, his face calm but cold. His eyes locked onto Mark's, showing no fear. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a chillingly smooth voice, the man said, "You have something that doesn't belong to you, officer." Mark's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched near his weapon, but he kept his voice steady. "This is my son," he said, his tone sharp. "And he's coming with me." The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "Your son." He let out a low chuckle. "Officer Reynolds, you buried your son 3 years ago. Everyone knows that." Mark's stomach twisted. The way the man spoke, as if he was mocking him, made his blood boil. Jacob gripped Mark's sleeve tightly. "Dad, don't listen to him," he whispered urgently. The man took a step closer. "Hand him over, and I'll forget this ever happened." Mark's heart pounded. Who was this man? What had he done to Jacob? "I'm giving you one chance," the man continued, his voice darkening. "Let the boy go, or you won't like what happens next." Mark stood his ground. His son had already been taken from him once. He wasn't going to let it happen again. He tightened his stance, his voice unwavering. "If you want him, you're going to have to go through me." For the first time, the man's expression changed. His smirk disappeared. His jaw tightened. Then he lifted his hand and snapped his fingers. In an instant, 2 more car doors swung open. More men stepped out. Mark's blood turned cold. This was far from over. Mark's heart pounded as the car doors swung open, revealing 2 more men stepping out. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing, their faces unreadable. The way they moved, calm, confident, told Mark one thing. They had done this before. Jacob's grip on Mark's sleeve tightened. "Dad," he whispered, his voice shaking. Mark's mind was racing. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't about to back down. He was a cop. He knew how to handle threats, but this wasn't just any situation. This was his son, and he had no idea what these men were capable of. The first man, the one who had spoken earlier, took a slow step forward. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something dangerous. He was testing Mark, seeing if he would break. Mark squared his shoulders. Not a chance. I don't know who you are, Mark said, keeping his voice calm but firm. But you made a big mistake coming after my son. The man smirked slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Officer Reynolds, he said, his tone almost mocking. I'm giving you one last chance. Hand him over, and no one gets hurt. Mark's fingers twitched near his holster. He wasn't about to let Jacob go, not after finding him again. Behind him, the backup officer had already radioed for more units, but would they get here in time? Mark needed to buy time. He tightened his grip on Jacob and took a small step back. You're not taking him, he said, his voice firm. I don't care who you are. He's coming with me. The man's smirk faded. His expression darkened. Wrong answer. Then he gave a slight nod to his men. Mark's breath caught as the two men reached into their jackets. Everything happened in a blur. Mark's instincts took over. He shoved Jacob behind him and dropped to a defensive stance. The backup officer reacted instantly, drawing his weapon. But before anyone could make a move, sirens. A flood of red and blue lights appeared from the distance. More police units were closing in fast. The men hesitated. The leader's jaw tightened as he realized they were out of time. He let out a slow breath, then gave another nod. Without a word, the men turned and rushed back into their car. Mark didn't move. His muscles were tense, ready for a fight. But the leader simply looked at him one last time, his eyes cold. This isn't over, he said smoothly. Then, with a screech of tires, the car sped off into the night. Mark didn't chase them. He couldn't risk leaving Jacob. Instead, he turned and looked at his son. Jacob's face was pale. His whole body was trembling. Mark placed his hands firmly on his shoulders. It's over, he said softly. But Jacob shook his head. His voice was barely above a whisper. No, Dad. It's just beginning. Mark stared at Jacob, his son's words sending a chill through him. It's just beginning. Even though the men had fled, Mark knew Jacob was right. Whoever they were, they wouldn't give up easily. This wasn't just about a traffic stop or some random crime. This was bigger. More police units arrived, sirens blaring as officers rushed to the scene. Mark barely registered them. His entire focus was on Jacob, his son, who had been gone for 3 years, now standing right in front of him. He gently squeezed Jacob's shoulders. You're safe now, he said, trying to reassure him. But Jacob shook his head, his hands trembling. No, Dad, you don't understand. They're everywhere. They're watching everything. His voice was filled with fear. They let us go because they wanted to, not because they were scared. Mark's stomach twisted. What kind of people were they dealing with? Before he could say anything, the backup officer approached. We need to get them to the station, he said, nodding toward Jacob and the girl. We need to know exactly what's going on. Mark agreed. He guided Jacob to the patrol car, keeping a protective arm around him. The girl, who had remained silent through most of this, finally spoke. They're not done, she said softly, looking at Mark with worried eyes. They always come back. Mark's jaw tightened. He needed answers. Now. Once at the police station, they were taken to a secure room. Jacob sat across from Mark, his eyes filled with emotions, fear, exhaustion, but also relief. He was safe, for now. Mark leaned forward. Jacob, I need you to tell me everything. Who were those men? Where have you been all this time? His voice was gentle but firm. I need to know the truth. Jacob hesitated. His fingers tapped nervously against the table. I don't know everything, he admitted. But they took me. 3 years ago, I woke up in a place I didn't recognize. They told me I had a new life now. They trained us, controlled us. And if we didn't listen, they... He stopped, his eyes darkening. Mark clenched his fists. What had they done to his son? Jacob took a deep breath. They made us believe we could never escape. But we did. And now they want us back. Mark's grip on the table tightened. That's not going to happen, he said firmly. You're home now. You're with me. Jacob looked at him with sad eyes. Dad, it's not that simple. Before Mark could respond, an officer knocked on the door and stepped in. His face was tense. Officer Reynolds, he said, we have a problem. Mark stood immediately. What is it? The officer hesitated, then said, the cameras outside just caught something. The same car that fled earlier. It's back. Mark's blood turned cold.